Good day, everyone. This is Nancy Ozawa. I'm Head of Marketing here at Javelin, and I would like to welcome you today to a webinar titled Hitting a Moving Target, Card Fraud in a Post-EMV Market. Today's webinar is provided as a complimentary webinar because it was sponsored by LexisNexis. So I would love to thank LexisNexis for your sponsorship of this webinar. For those who may not be familiar with LexisNexis, LexisNexis Risk Solutions is a leader in providing essential information that helps customers across all industries and government access, predict, and manage risk. So thank you so much for LexisNexis. Before we get started, I do want to hit a few housekeeping items. I do want to let you know that the webinar is going to be recorded, and it will be available about a few days after today, probably early next week. You will get an email from us via LexisNexis that will be giving you a link to the webinar as well as access to the slide deck. And there actually is a white paper that they are going to provide as well. So all of that information will be coming to you as an email. There's also a link at the very end of this deck, and you can click on that to access more information. So stay tuned and we'll get all that information for you. I want to introduce today's presenters today to our speakers. We've got two of them. Our first one is Al Pasquale, who is the Head of Fraud and Security here at Javelin. And Al is in charge of tracking topics such as biometrics and banking and payments, the effects of data breaches on the integrity of consumer identities, and the relationship with identity, fraud, and loyalty, and how best to secure payment card data and transactions. So very well primed for this webinar. Our other speaker is Kimberly Little-Sutherland. Kim is responsible for identifying and guiding LexisNexis' technology. She's responding to the constant evolving market needs for identity proofing and authentication in commercial and government organizations. And Kim is at LexisNexis. So those are our two presenters. Just before I hand it over to get us started, I do encourage you to ask questions. The question session will be at the very end of this webinar. Feel free to look to the right-hand side of your screen. There is a chat question box. You can put your questions in there. They'll come over here to the speakers, and they'd be happy to answer as many questions as we can put into the webinar. So as you think of them, write them down, and we will make sure we try to pose as many of them as we can to the speakers. If we run out of time, we will try to follow up with you afterwards to get all of your questions answered. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Al to kick off today's webinar.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. So before we dive into the content, I do want to preface that with a bit of background on how we got to this point. Obviously, LexisNexis was a sponsor for this research conducted by Javelin. You know, all of Javelin's research is conducted independently, and the conclusions we arrive to are independent as well. And this is a quantitative and qualitatively driven study. And so by that I mean we went out to the market and surveyed 100 risk and fraud decision makers within the financial services space, specifically at U.S. card issuers. And the panel included issuers of all sizes, debit, credit, and prepaid. We also interviewed in a more intimate way, one-on-one, a number of executives within the financial services space to get their perspectives on card fraud. You know, so that way it wasn't just, you know, folks, answering the same old questions, you know, across the line. It was more color, more depth, and you're going to see and hear some of that as we work our way through today's presentation. So with that, I want to start with the agenda. We are going to take a look at some of the overall metrics that we captured during the study, and gives us a sense of where issuers were before EMV and some of the things that they were anticipating post-EMV. And I think this is useful background for everyone when we start to explore the challenges that issuers are facing and the solutions that they're using. Right? And we're going to do a bit of that in our application fraud discussion and our discussion on account takeover, and then Tim and I will crystallize all of this into a series of conclusions and recommendations. So we are at an inflection point, right? We've passed the liability shift date for EMV at the point of sale in the United States, and I mean, really, we are in a post-EMV U.S. market. And a lot of folks who thought it was never going to happen, you know, it was us, Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, right? We were in some good company, but at the end of the day, it did happen, right? There were a lot of factors that drove that, things like the liability shift, but also certainly the target breach. And so now what we want to do is take a look at some of the loss experiences that issuers were having prior to the liability shift, and then what they were expecting post. We're going to dissect that a little bit and then move on. And so, quote, I want to say right from the horse's mouth, but it's not a nice thing to say about anybody, but in speaking with one of the executives during the course of this study, one of the things that he had pointed out was that EMV adoption, as it ramps up, it's going to put pressure on the identity theft space, specifically application fraud and account takeovers, right? And this is a perspective that has evolved a bit. And so we're going to share some other perspectives we saw on the data, but keep this particular quote in mind because it's an important one. So this is going to help us put our arms, or wrap our arms around the size of this problem, right? It's a big round pie chart. It almost kind of looks like a globe, and that number makes it feel like a globe, right? Like the size of the earth, $10.9 billion in total card fraud losses in the United States across credit, debit, and prepaid. Now, that prepaid slice of the pie there is small. As volumes increase, we can certainly expect that to grow. But the fact of the matter is, when you're looking at this pie chart, what stands out is the big blue Pac-Man looking face of credit card losses, right, at $7.6 billion. And now certainly there's an opportunity, in the U.S. market to reduce that with the introduction of EMV and its use at the point of sale. And obviously credit cards were one of the first places many issuers went to reissue. But we also know that card fraud is going to change, right? And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So while we'll put some downward pressure, on Pac-Man here, fact of the matter is he's going to stay strong for a number of other reasons as well. So let's cut this up, dive a little bit more deeply, and give the attendees a way to see how they stack up against the industry as a whole. So what we're looking at are fraud losses per card, right? Very clear credit card, clearly that's the clear leader, $9 per card fraud loss among U.S. issuers. Debit card considerably lower, 2.8. Prepaid kind of straddles the line, in the middle. Again, really highlighting the serious need / opportunity we have, in the credit card space. I think the prepaid number is still going to move a bit here going forward. But Kim, last slide, this slide, how does that align with, what you're hearing from clients?
So, hey Al, thanks. More focus is definitely on credit cards and debit cards, but I do receive several questions regarding interest in understanding more about the prepaid card fraud space. And like you said, as it relates to these two slides that we've talked about, because that piece of the pie is so much smaller, there is less focus there. So there definitely will be a need for subsequent studies and focus to really get to that number. And we agree that as we see more adoption in prepaid cards, that the type of fraud may be different, but the fraud losses are of significant concern to our customers.
And given these numbers, especially the one on the last page, that makes 100% sense. So look at some of the losses. Now let's look at attitudes briefly. When we spoke to issuers and we asked them, what was your attitude, or how do you feel about EMV? What do you think the impact is going to be? We see a response that's pretty consistent with the story that you've been hearing if you've been out there at conferences over the past few years, and when folks were talking about what happened in other markets, this is kind of what they were taking away from it, right? So point of sale card fraud, it's going to go down. If you look at that second set of data, the blue bar, the dark blue, light blue, those are folks who basically agree. Moving to EMV, it's going to reduce fraud, point of sale, no doubt. And I think that's it's very much a true statement. There are clear reasons as to why that happens. right? EMV cards are practically impossible to counterfeit. You have the dynamic cryptogram during the transaction, so if you glean that data in a breach at the point of sale, it becomes largely useless, right? Makes a lot of sense. But at the top, you have 30% who strongly agree, 32% who agree that the EMV migration is going to cause an increase in card not present. Now, not to say that isn't true, but we need to talk a little bit more about how that's going to play out, right? And that's what we're going to be doing here, and ultimately what the implications are for managing or mitigating some of those more substantial types of fraud risk. So I want to explain this a little bit here. When we think about how fraud occurs, we get a lot of intelligence that's going to guide us in understanding how fraud will then evolve. And so when we looked at other markets, I mean, we did see indications that proved this true. And so by that I mean, when criminals commit fraud at the point of sale, is a very specific methodology, right? You've done it for, if you're a criminal, 5, 10, 20 years, you're very good at it, you know how it works, you know where to get the card data, you know how to encode the cards, you do it in the hotel room before you go out to Walmart, right? And you're ready to go. You know the stores that are stores that are easy to go to commit fraud. And you ultimately know how to move the product after the fact. Card not present fraud is a different game, right? You have to know how to circumvent the tools that online merchants are using. So you have to know ultimately too which online merchants are weak, right? So you don't rip off Walmart today and tomorrow rip off Walmart.com. It takes a bit of time, a bit of education, and what we saw in places like the UK was a significant growth in application fraud, account takeover, mail interception, telling us that criminals, they wanted to keep doing what they were doing at the point of sale. They needed more cards. EMV was drying up that opportunity for them. And so they found alternative ways to do that by imitating the identity of legitimate consumers, imitating the identity of legitimate cardholders, and getting EMV cards, right? So not to say that card not present fraud is a huge problem. It is a huge problem, right? And it's a problem that's only going to get bigger and over time as EMV is pervasive and those cards are everywhere, 2019, 2020 or so, right? Card not present fraud is just going to be absolutely where it's at for any kind of merchant-oriented fraudster. But fact of the matter is, between now and then, we have to deal with criminals who need more cards, right? So that's what's going to lead into a little bit of our story here around application fraud. So now we're going to take a look at how issuers consider the risk of application fraud and how they're managing that risk. But before we do that, another opportunity to go back to some of the conversations that we had with some of these issuers. And it's around the challenges that they faced in discerning between the legitimate applicant or a legitimate applicant and one who is using someone else's information, right? The ongoing data compromise events are continuing to present a challenge. The whole authentication space is really tough because of the limited elements we have. They're all static, easy to compromise from a number of sources, such as phishing breaches, etc. Right? So when you have a business that's based on, or you're attempting to discern identity based on PII, and we have breaches. We have breaches at places like UCLA Health, right? Or we have breaches a couple years back at state of South Carolina, or you have breaches at places like Primera, right? The question becomes, with all of that sensitive data floating out there, what are my options and what does that mean? What kind of threats am I going to see now because of that? So I think what we need to do then is kind of split out the identity threats. And so when we talked to these issuers and we asked them, so what buckets would you put application fraud in that you've experienced over the past year? And the options were stolen identity. And by that we mean, what we call true name fraud, right? So you've taken someone's whole identity and you're using it as though you are them. That was 41% of the cases, right? Manipulated identity, sometimes also called a hybrid identity. Some people even think of this as a form of synthetic, but ultimately it is using a mix of different data points from an individual. And this is a difficult thing to discern. You look to a credit report and you see several people, right, using the same social security number. And they may have long histories each, right? And that's going to make your life difficult. And then finally, 31% said synthetic. Now, synthetic is a tough thing to track, too, right? At the end of the day, the fact of the matter is when we say synthetic, we mean information that can't be traced to any individual. A good example being when a criminal uses a child's social security number. Right? There's not going to be a credit bureau report for that child. Meanwhile, they're free to mix and match, even create an entire credit profile and use that to commit something like a bust-out scheme, right? And walk away with a whole lot of money. So before we move into some of the other responses, we're going to go on to a poll. So how much of a problem is preventing application fraud from synthetic identities for your institution? All right, so it's a severe problem. It's challenging, but it's getting better. We have it under reasonable control. It's a problem that we know of. Don't know, not applicable. Right? And no matter where you are in the spectrum, I can tell you that we've dealt with clients who are somewhere on this spectrum. Kind of given how the space is evolving, how digital applications are becoming such a big deal, right? More folks tend to fall in those first two buckets than they fall into the third and fourth. So with that, go ahead and close it out. Let's see where we are. Oh, there we go. All right. So 13% says severe problem, challenging 21%. We have 19% reasonable control, 21% is not a problem. So about a quarter in the not applicable bucket, about a third in the top two, right? And 40%, 4 out of 10 in 3 and 4. So it looks like pretty decent distribution, but you know, it's not a problem that we know of. I'm thinking it's more that we know of, and it's not a problem. We'd love to have a conversation, know what you're doing. If you're having a lot of success, you're measuring it, you're feeling good about it, but you would really, I think, be in the minority, and you actually are, according to this data. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So we had asked about a number of different aspects of managing the risk of application fraud. And one of the things we asked about is the difficulty that an issuer has in managing application fraud through different channels, right? So where are you having the most trouble in managing that risk? And you know, I think this is an opportunity in the co-brand and private label space. You know, right now it's one of the spaces in credit cards that's still doing well, right, or still growing, and folks are looking to take advantage of that. The fact of the matter is, issuers also told us that, hey, you know, my affiliates on my website, my partner, my client at co-brand card site where I'm taking those applications, I'm having the hardest time detecting fraud through that channel. Now, I mean, it could be a function of the tools that you're using in that channel, right? It could be a function of what the partner is letting you even do in the first place. Because I think for the folks who are not playing in this space, something that's really important to consider is that when you have a client partner, like a merchant, right, or an airline, they have very different motivations than you do. They're compensated in a very different way than you are. And so that's going to lead them to ask you to do things when it comes to fraud mitigation that you may not think are best practice or you may not want to do. And so I think that's why we see also online at your affiliate's website as the top choice, and then in person at your affiliate's website, you know, as the third choice. Mobile, a clear challenge, you know, as more folks move into the mobile space, we're still figuring out the tools that work best there. But you know, this challenge, private label co-brand, not a huge surprise, at least not from my conversations. Kim, what are you taking from this?
You know, so the thing that really jumps out to me on this is just the challenges in general around multiple channels. And our customers that are either issuers or other players in the ecosystem, like financial institutions, they echo these concerns definitely. They're heavily focused on trying to understand and even trying to address some of the fraud risk that they see in the different channels. So whether it be on a web browser, on a mobile device, or trying to deal with an affiliate. And so they also tend to be more concentrated on some of the challenges they're experiencing with the mobile channel especially.
It's a good point. I mean, everything except outside of mail, you know, is 40%. I think that is interesting, though, to point out too. Mail, 29%. I think that may also indicate that folks out there are just having a hard time when provided with just PII in verifying whether or not they're dealing with legitimate applicant. Right? So it tells us a lot.
Yeah, and I think the other piece about that is that if you compare mail to everything else, mail is the slow pace, right? And so people will need quick responses and all these other channels. So yeah, you have time to do a lot more due diligence when in a mail channel because the expectation of a response is not there, or at least a timely response is not there. And these others, we're making real-time decisions or near real-time decisions, and that's where the challenges start to come into play.
That's a great point, Kim. That's a great point. So how then are issuers managing this risk, right, during account origination, account opening? We broke down the use of different solutions, and we broke them down by whether or not they're using it to verify identity or to prevent fraud. Now, the distinction there is when you start thinking about CIP, right? It is something we all have to do, part of the Patriot Act, Customer Identification Program, making sure that that name and the social and the date of birth, they all match, they all belong to a single individual, right? But at the end of the day, there's an inherent challenge for a lot of folks in the industry because we've relied on that core information. Not just to obviously do what we had to do since 2001, but to really determine whether or not we're dealing with that legitimate applicant. And that's where we run into problems, right? Because base PII, that what we call sensitive information in and of itself, is just not enough, right? Kim, if there's a bevy of options on here, right? But which combinations or solutions, or how do the attendees even approach figuring out how to layer these things?
So first, I always want to say that I think it's great to see that the issuers in the study were trying to use multiple products in order to try to mitigate their fraud and identity verification risk. But one thing that the attendees, once they really get a chance to digest the study, will see that it's really a strategic deployment of these capabilities and layering them in an integrated manner that's going to be the most effective thing for them to do. So it's not randomly picking the most used item, for example, but it's really using them in combination. And I'll also highlight that dynamic KBA and static KBA showed up at the very top, but if you look at how those are used, they're very different. So dynamic KBA is most used for fraud verification, whereas static KBA is least used for identity verification. Seeing those kind of nuances is really important in terms of understanding. And then static KBA, which has received a really bad rap for a long time, although it's interesting to see how those types of static questions have also evolved. But the participants in the study actually said that static KBA is where they use it in more of a fraud mitigation or combination standpoint. And for fraud mitigation only, dynamic KBA, according to the respondents, was least used.
Yeah, it's
so the key to me is knowing the use case, and, and applying the right combination of solutions for your use case versus having a one-size-fits-all approach, regardless of of what you're trying to address.
Yeah, there's a quote, and I actually don't think it's in this deck, but it was around considering all of these different tools in a very holistic way, right? Scoring those applicants based on the inputs you're getting from some of these tools, and being able to kind of turn the dials and knobs right over time based on how those solutions are performing. And I imagine that you've heard and you're facilitating much the same thing.
And there's a great section in the study that does highlight the importance of using identity scores and more of a platform approach. So you're absolutely right.
So moving outside of the, we have a quick question. I do want to answer this one because it's about descriptions or about terms. What is KBA? What's PII? KBA, knowledge-based authentication. Right? Comes in two forms, static and dynamic. Static, you think of the kind of the questions where the answers don't change. So things like, what was your mother's maiden name? Where'd you go to high school? Dynamic. Those are the kinds of questions that they can pull from. They can be pulled from public records. It can be pulled from account history. It can be pulled from a credit report. But the questions, are different. The answers can be different over time for some questions. And so, what was your, monthly mortgage payment, or which houses, did you own in 2004, in 2008?
Right. Which of the following vehicles were registered at 123 Main Street? And for sure, and when you lived at Main Street and you drove that, Honda Accord or whatever it may have been. So asking those kind of questions. Absolutely.
And then PII, personally identifiable information, name, date of birth, social. Some people extend that to other identifiers, phone number, those kinds of things.
So Al and I are going to check each other to make sure we don't use acronyms without letting you know what it means. So.
It's completely force of habit. Thank you, Kim. All right. So, on this slide, another thing that we wanted to touch on was, the human touch, I guess, right? The use of the manual review fraud operations. Some people call it, and certainly some people will use this process, within, underwriting. But it's, taking those applications that don't score well, or those applications that hit a red flag, and getting them over to somebody for a deeper dive, for that extended due diligence. And what we saw was encouraging here, but it's a double-edged sword. So it's encouraging because we saw a lot of folks using the manual review process for both credit underwriting and fraud detection. They have separate processes. Makes a lot of sense. That means that you really are trying to discern between credit risk and fraud risk. Right way to go about doing it. But the fact of the matter is, while this can be very effective, it is not very cost effective. It doesn't scale well when you're talking about hundreds, thousands, millions of applications. You only want the highest risk stuff ended up here, right? Because otherwise, having a human being sit down and go through all these applications one by one, it's not going to be timely. You're going to lose, applicants that way, lose their interest certainly. And then on top of that, it's just going to clog up your pipeline, right? Kim, so let me take another way. What are you hearing from clients about managing this process?
Well, so most of our customers, have definitely identified that they need some form of manual review. So I don't think that you can get away from that, and I don't think it's a bad thing. But I think that to improve consistency in that process, the auditability of your manual review process, and even the efficiency, as Al said, it is a more costly approach. There needs to be tools added into that manual review process. So that's really a necessity to make even your manual review process effective. So I actually don't think that there are as many differences or as many differences between manual review and automated processes that you would have maybe on your website or on the front end in your call center than there have been in the past, because it is important to still give those manual review representatives the right tools to help them in their process.
Absolutely, but I think going back to what we discussed earlier too, having identity scoring that can help make sure that you're doing this in an efficient way is critical, right? So we talked a bit about application fraud, right? We talked a bit about the tools that folks are using, where they feel there are challenges in the channels, and when they're bringing, or at least if they're bringing people to the table to actually dive into their applications. There's a lot in the study, by the way, so you will have access to a copy. We talk a lot more about this issue, a lot more data in the report around both application fraud mitigation, and now we're going to move into account takeover. But I definitely suggest you take some time and read a little bit of what we have in there. We build on a lot of the quotes that we get out of our one-on-one interviews. We have a section that talks briefly about first-party fraud, because we have to recognize that it's there and kind of the noise that it adds to the process. But it's good reading if you have the time. I just suggest it. So moving into account takeover, right? So this was the other big thing. Going back to that very first quote, right? Worried about application fraud, account takeover. Makes sense given how the environment is going to change, how criminals are going to adapt. In fact, the matter is, we've seen this in other data as well. We're seeing things like application fraud start to move in the direction we're expecting. So, This isn't just theoretical. It's this is something we should be preparing for. So now we want to take a look at how issuers were kind of managing it, what are their perspectives, their challenges, their responses, right? And a quote, this went out of a regional institution, regional FI this time. A lot of management around account takeover, even app fraud, is training the banker to recognize it. We've invested in both the call center and banking centers, ensuring that this piece is included during training. In the banking center, it is annual, with some complementing content throughout the year. And this is important when you start thinking about account takeover and where it tends to head, right? It's some people use the fraud and the balloon analogy, right? Criminals are just going to pull on the chain until they find the weakest link, and sometimes it's the call center, and that's why this quote and this kind of mindset and approach towards training is so critical. But we'll talk more about that here in a second as well. So before that, actually, we're going to jump into a poll. My institution cannot reduce account takeover without adding too much friction into the customer experience. A little bit simpler answer this time, right? Can I stop something as insidious as account takeover? Now, again, I don't want to shade the responses, but I do want to share a little of my perspective. We've seen in our data for many years that account takeover, when you start talking about resolution and detection and misuse, the rates at which that occur are much, much higher, and they take much, much longer than other types of fraud, traditional fraud, counterfeiting, lost, stolen, right? And part of the problem for institutions has been discerning between the legitimate customer and the criminal who's taken over the account, because that criminal may have information about a lot of legitimate information about that customer, right? They may have changed login credentials, they may have changed mailing addresses, and that adds to some of the challenge. So let's go ahead and move on to the answer. And 24% say friction's a challenge, 64% say we could do it without adding too much friction, and 12% say it doesn't really apply. So that is very encouraging. That 64% feel like we can take steps to mitigate account takeover without adding too much friction. And again, for those folks, always interested to hear some examples, case studies, stories about best practices you're experiencing, so we can share them more broadly with the industry. So that being said, taking a look at how how some of the other folks kind of responded to that general idea, right? How is account takeover affecting you? How do you feel like you can deal with it? When we spoke to issuers, about 2/3 of those 100 issuers said that my institution has account takeover fraud under control, right? So they were optimistic, in that. And just given how much damage account takeover can do, both from a fraud loss perspective, from an out-of-pocket perspective to the consumer, right? Because these cases, can really drag out and result in all kinds of ancillary costs you may not think of, right? So getting things notified, retaining a lawyer, taking time off work. So that's a really encouraging stat. My institution cannot reduce it without adding too much friction. I think that was generally on my maybe a little less optimistic than the folks on the phone, but pretty close. But this one kind of goes the other way, right? This is account takeover fraud will get more problematic because of mobile. Again, this is an area where there's a clear need, I think, to manage some of that risk, right? It's mobile. I think friction at this opportunity, despite how good everyone feels, I think we can do better there. And then the call center, we'll talk on the next slide. But Kim, you wanted to expand before we moved on, I think, on the issue of friction. Did you not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the user experience or increased friction is often a major concern for our customers. And I think the key there is that it depends on who in your organization you're talking to. So while the compliance and security team may have one view, in the same company, the marketing and we've even run into chief customer experience officers, so people who are really focused on that experience of the user. They're very concerned about friction, and they're looking at friction by the channel in which the consumer is coming in on, along with even the demographics of the customer. So it might be there's a different expectation of how they're going to interact with the company depending on what age group they're in. So I think that leveraging analytics and fraud models and scores into your process is one way to help augment and even prevent some of the extra friction that can occur, because then you can better identify the types of solutions and take more of a risk-based approach to addressing your account takeover fraud concerns.
No, it's a great point, right? It's we do a lot of work here at Javelin around customer experience in digital, and for my clients within the fraud and security practice, the issue of customer experience is an important one, but they also have to balance that with fraud loss. Whereas, for some of my peers here, they're talking to folks, they're talking to the chief marketing officer, they're talking to the head of digital, right, or the head of mobile, and customer experience is at the very top of the list, right? Mm-hmm. And so, kind of balancing the needs of the organization is certainly a challenge when it comes to managing friction and the experience. So, great point, Kim. Thank you. The call center. Right. I think that the first response is the hallmark of account takeover. Difficulty contacting the account holder. That's how account takeover, that's how it works, right? It's the criminal essentially taking control of the account, trying to prevent the issuer from getting in contact with that legitimate account holder so they can go on doing, what they want to do. Now, that's part and parcel, but what doesn't, I think, necessarily have to be part and parcel are the challenges in the call center. But it's clear that the customer service staff, and this can even be via chat, right? But what issuers saw as a huge problem in managing ATO in the study was preventing their customer service staff from being socially engineered. And why is that such a big deal? I mean, you think back to one of those earlier slides where we had like KBA. Or heck, I mean, you could take almost any solution on that list even. Really, if that customer service rep has the ability to either provide an answer or bypass a solution, when their mandate is to delight the person on the other end of the line or the other end of that chat screen, then that can lead to problems. It can lead to fraud problems. You're incentivizing your customer service staff based on the surveys that you're handing out to customers after a call, rating them on their quality of service on a 5-point scale. So having them implement stronger, security during a call, can backfire from their perspective. And so, that's obviously why we're seeing some of these challenges. Now there are, I think there are opportunities where we could do this better, right? It's not just in the call center. Obviously, mobile's a challenge, online's a challenge. It's not just because it's not just PII that's out there. There's email addresses, there's usernames and passwords, and a problem with reusing those as well, which is why we need strong authentication. But a lot of opportunities all around. But that call center, I mean, that really stands out. Kim, do you have any examples you can share?
Well, what I was just going to say is that managing risk in call centers, it starts often before many of the solutions that were laid out in the earlier slides, because it starts with understanding even the origin of the call or the frequency of the call. We look a lot at velocity of the user and the specific phone number, for example. And then other risk indicators that you can build a risk model around before you even know who the caller is. So to address the concerns around social engineering, which the challenge there is that it's inherent to being, I think, a human being, that we ultimately, despite what's said on the evening news sometimes, we ultimately want to help each other. So to try to balance that and also address other methods of account takeover fraud, it takes a holistic approach that looks at the transaction as it comes in to the channel, so in this scenario, into the call center, and then it gives those tools that allow the customer service staff to have a consistent approach in how they do things, so that they don't have to try to balance their desire to be helpful with their need to also have a secure process.
Yeah, and and it's a great point, Kim, and I go back to the slide around training, and how critical that is. But there's an opportunity to take some of that off the plate of the customer service staff, to your point, right, and do some things that allow you to discern fraud risk before the conversation even starts. But I think to the challenges to the training piece, that also in the call center, those are places with typically very high turnover as well. So it becomes even more critical to find ways to manage that risk without relying heavily on that customer service staff to protect an account, right, or giving them the opportunity to do things within an account before knowing with certainty that the person that they're dealing with, is in fact legitimate. That's just, it leads to trouble at the end of the day. So where's all this headed? With all of these challenges, application fraud, account takeover, the channels that they're facing, and complications, how are issuers going to respond, right? And so we asked about whether or not they were going to make significant investments, and kind of where those investments would be, right? And better than 3/4 of issuers say that they're making significant investments in fraud mitigation. Now, it breaks down between tools and more headcount, and just simply more time among the folks you do have to manage fraud. But it's tools first and foremost, and that makes a lot of sense. Fraud continues to evolve, right? And we see a bevy of new solutions, new controls that are available to us in the market, and a lot of them have matured very well, right? And they're designed to deal with some of these new risks that we're seeing, especially in places like digital channels. According to our data last year, there were about 80 million applications that were started or completed online or via mobile, right? That's a big number, and I mean that's it's a new development in the history of banking to be able to do that. So when there's so much of that PII floating out there, you need those new digital tools. That top response makes a lot of sense. But folks are still going to invest more employee time. They're going to put more people, on the phones, more people in fraud operations, more people who are looking at the tools that they're using and measuring the performance, right? More people in fraud analytics. And then hiring, a little less than half said that they were going to hire. Again, that's a really significant cost, or can be, maybe not as efficient as we would like it to be. The fact of the matter is, for a lot of issuers, it's going to start with the tools and getting people into place to use them. Kim, does this surprise you? Is it consistent, inconsistent with what you're hearing?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. In the first 6 months, we've seen many of our existing customers and new customers look to invest in additional tools. And the types of things that they're looking at, though, range from identity document authentication, so ways that they can maybe not just make it easier for, or actually making it easier for their customer to help them reduce the risk. So maybe using a driver's license, for example, and scanning that ID, and then extracting the data off of it, so that now the benefit is that the customer doesn't have to manually input it. So they have a much stronger approach now in that whole flow. To complementing their existing workflows with analytic scores. So, and they're using that to improve their decisioning process. So I think that the investments that are being made now and will continue throughout the year will not be to overhaul their workflows. I mean, people have spent a lot of time trying to build out good flows today, but now it's really just to complement the processes they have in place.
Gotcha. I mean, we're already part of the way through the year. I'm sure it's not the end of the surprises that we've seen from a fraud perspective either, right? So I think maybe some follow-up just between you and I, in 6 months to see what else you're hearing would be useful from my perspective, anyway.
Absolutely.
So let's move into the conclusions, right? So crystallize everything that we've heard, everything we've talked about, give folks an opportunity to ask, some questions. So final thoughts. You have to be ready to evolve. As I mentioned, the migration to EMV in the long term definitely an effect, huge effect, card not present, but fact of the matter is in the interim, especially with digital account opening, right? We're going to see really significant growth in application fraud. And digital account opening, consider this, 2004, 2005 in the UK during the transition, there was no digital account opening, right? And so, where you can go to almost any issuer now and apply for an account online. We're in a different environment. Mobile wallets, 2004, 2005 UK, or even Canada during their transition, which was much more recent. There were no mobile wallets like we have today, no Apple Pay, no Samsung Pay. So there are these new capabilities that we've brought to bear to improve the customer experience, to give them more opportunities to use our product at the end of the day. But as a result, it opens up the door for new fraud challenges, right? So we're in a bit of a turbulent time, partially of our own making as we try to facilitate the customer's needs, and partially as we offer up new ways to mitigate fraud in some channels, right? Enforcing criminals to change their behavior. Another takeaway, and Kim did a great job of articulating some of this, but really balancing automation and the human factor, right? Having analytics play a large role, understand, the lift you're getting out of your tools and how effective they're proving over time, and then really, passing on, some of those folks to a human being so that they can do the deep dive. So you have your experts working on the things that the experts should be working on, and not, issues that really don't exist in the first place. And then the last bit is looking past applicant-provided data. Now, if you are heavily reliant on PII, and you may say, well, I have device identification, we need to have a conversation, because that in and of itself is not nearly enough. Fact of the matter is, so much of this information is being bought and sold. A full ID costs $5, right? So much of it is bought and sold now that anything that's reliant on PII alone, whether it's account opening, whether it's authentication, there are still issuers that allow people to gain access to an account with a social security number, right? That is a problem, and especially with digital channels. So we need to look past that. We need to take advantage of tools that are not relying on the data the applicant provides us, right? And not forcing us to vet those only, to give us more options that are specific to the channel, because that's where we're going to realize the greatest success. So with that, I'm going to move into some questions. And I'm going to toss out the first question to you here, Kim. Do you find KBA tools to be helpful with stopping identity theft?
So that is a very complex question. It depends on how you've deployed KBA and the types of who your demographics are and the type of risk that you're trying to address. So I think that KBA can definitely be a part of an effective solution as long as the right layers are deployed and where in the workflow it happens. So we've seen KBA, as it showed in the study, that for identity verification especially, dynamic KBA, so differentiating static versus dynamic KBA is extremely effective in a layered model for identity verification. Dynamic KBA, depending on how you're using it, may have a different way to deploy it if you're using it as an authentication method after an account has already been set up. So I guess the short answer is yes, but the real answer is make sure that you are deploying it in an effective manner.
And Kim, we just got another question. Again, I think someone missed the last piece on this, but can you explain the difference between dynamic and static again for everybody?
Mm-hmm. So static KBA is one where the question is given and you set the answer. That's the way I describe it. So for example, they're not looking, no one knows if they ask a question, what's your favorite book? And you say, I don't know, Jane Eyre. That no one has the answers already from some type of authoritative data source that says, no, that's not the book you check out from the library. Instead, so that's a static question. You're setting the answer, and those questions have become quite interesting actually over the years. The old typical question was, what's your mother's maiden name? But now there's all types of different questions. Dynamic KBA is one in which the questions change on a regular basis, and the answer choices even change. So if I take a quiz that's a dynamic knowledge-based authentication quiz, I might get 3 3 totally different questions or 5 totally different questions depending on if I've been in the process before and other ways. So it's dynamically being adjusted, at least with the types of questions that are asked, and then depending on the sophistication of the engine, the questions may change depending on your risk that you're presenting.
Okay, thank you, Kim. So I'm going to go ahead and take one more question. We have a few options, but yeah, I'm going to give you one more. I've done a lot of talking, and actually, you can probably hear it. I've been sick for the past like 3 days. So what are some high-level industry best practices to combat online app fraud? We've discussed some of that here, but I mean, anything that you want to call out?
So I think that so this is at the time of the application. I think it has to start, even though you've definitely said that you can't end with just looking at the PII, but doing identity verification and comparing the data that has been provided is very important in that process. After you've done the verification steps, then making sure that you've also done something to not just say, is that person real, but is this really the owner of the identity? And that can be done in many ways today, ranging from knowledge-based authentication to phone verification and one-time password to a series of different types of options. But making sure that in your process, you're not making sure that Kim is real, but also making sure that it's Kim who's applying. Those are some important steps in that process.
And Kim, it was a bit of a setup and a little unfair because LexisNexis actually offers a variety of solutions that kind of fit that mold, right? So I asked you to pick among your favorite kids, or pick your favorite kids to have. So I'm going to do one more question because it looks like we got a few more minutes. As convenient as it may be to customers, do you foresee financial institutions using biometrics for authentication in the future? I'm going to share a little bit about kind of what we've seen, and Kim, if you share your experiences as well, but absolutely, and it does depend on use case, and that's going to affect what modality we see, but I can tell you just from our data alone that nearly half of the largest FIs in the country are now using Touch ID for their mobile banking app, right? I mean, that's huge, right? And what that's a function of is the fact that now it is largely available. It's convenient. People are familiar with it. They believe in it. Again, it's quasi-free in that case, but it also instills a greater sense of security, right? And then you have other applications. Voice is an application, in the call center or even through the mobile device that has taken years to get off the ground, but is now proving to be quite mature, and then can bring you some customer service benefits along the way. And that's really how it's being positioned. And so we're hearing from our clients as well, really excited about all the implications for voice. So absolutely, we're seeing the adoption, we're seeing the use, and we expect that to kind of trickle down too, right? So even if you're a smaller institution, odds are your mobile banking provider provides an integration with Touch ID, right? Or even with some of the other biometric solutions in the market. And so if you're not having the conversation, with your platform provider, I think you should reach out. Kim, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would definitely like, as you have that conversation, extend how you're going to have ask some key questions. So I think that biometrics in its entirety is a great form of authentication, and it's a very strong one. The challenge is going to be, whose biometric is it? And so LexisNexis heavily focuses on having an authenticated enrollment process so that whose fingerprint has been captured or voice print, and you're not just using one that's being sent to you via Touch ID. So the way that many of our customers try to address this is that they, at the time of linking the account to the biometric, they may do some form of verification or identity authentication that's very similar to what they would have done in an account application step. And then now they have added assurance that they know who they're actually tying that fingerprint to, so that way they can have it with the right account, with the right level of trust.
Absolutely. Kim, we're actually doing well. more questions coming in, but there really isn't much in the way of time. So what we're going to do is we'll take the questions. Kim and I will take a look. We'll get back to everybody. I really want to just point out the URL for everybody. Thank LexisNexis for being the sponsor of this study. Great research, really appreciative. And there's a survey at the end of this. We would love your feedback, just to get a sense of what you took away from it. Was it useful to you? Kim, thank you for joining me today. Thanks again to LexisNexis. And I hope our attendees enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you have a good rest of the week and an excellent weekend. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Al.